Welcome to my channel. Emma adjusted the strap of her handbag as she stepped into the bustling office canteen, the hum of chatter and clinking cutlery filling the air. She had always found comfort in the predictability of her routine, early mornings, late nights, and the occasional lunch date with Daniel. But today something felt off. The canteen, usually a place of mundane familiarity, seemed charged with an unspoken tension, though she couldn't quite put her finger on why. Daniel had been acting strange lately. Not in an obvious way, but in the subtle shifts that only someone who knew him as well as she did would notice. The way he hesitated before answering her questions, the way his phone always seemed to face down on the table, the way he'd started working late more often than not. Emma had brushed it off at first, chalking it up to the stress of his high-profile cases at the law firm. But the nagging feeling in her chest refused to quiet. She spotted him almost immediately, seated at their usual corner table. His dark hair was slightly disheveled, and his tie loosened, as though he'd been running his hands through it in frustration. For a moment, she allowed herself to admire him, the sharp line of his jaw, the way his eyes crinkled when he smiled. He was still the same man she'd fallen for 3 years ago, the man who had promised her a future filled with love and stability. But as she approached the table, her steps faltered. Daniel wasn't alone. A young woman sat across from him, her glossy auburn hair catching the fluorescent light as she leaned forward, laughing at something he'd said. Emma's stomach tightened. She recognized the woman, Sophia, the new intern at Daniel's firm. She'd seen her once or twice during office gatherings, always hovering on the periphery, her gaze lingering a little too long on Daniel. Emma forced a smile as she reached the table, her heart pounding in her ears. "Hey," she said, her voice steady despite the storm brewing inside her. Daniel looked up, his expression flickering with something she couldn't quite place. Guilt? Surprise? "Emma," he said, standing abruptly. "I didn't know you were coming by today." "I thought I'd surprise you," she replied, her eyes darting to Sophia, who was now sitting back in her chair, a faint smirk playing on her lips. "Oh, hi, Emma," Sophia said, her tone dripping with faux sweetness. "Daniel was just telling me about this case he's working on. It's so fascinating." Emma nodded, her smile tightening. "I'm sure it is." She turned to Daniel, her gaze searching his face for answers he wasn't ready to give. "Can we talk for a minute?" "Of course," he said, though his voice lacked its usual warmth. He glanced at Sophia, who gave a small wave before gathering her things and sauntering off, her heels clicking against the tiled floor. Emma waited until Sophia was out of earshot before speaking. "What was that about?" she asked, her tone sharper than she'd intended. Daniel sighed, running a hand through his hair. "It's nothing, Em. She's just an intern. We were going over some case files." In the canteen, Emma crossed her arms, her eyes narrowing. "Since when do you discuss work over lunch with interns?" Daniel's jaw tightened, and for a moment, he looked as though he might argue. But then his shoulders slumped, and he reached for her hand. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice softening. "I know I've been distant lately. It's just, work has been crazy, and I haven't been handling it well. I didn't mean to make you feel like you're not a priority." Emma searched his eyes, looking for the truth behind his words. She wanted to believe him, to let herself be comforted by his touch. But the image of him laughing with Sophia, the way their heads had been so close together, lingered in her mind like a shadow. "I just need you to be honest with me," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "If something's going on, I need to know." Daniel hesitated, his grip on her hand tightening. "There's nothing going on," he said, his tone firm. "You're the only one I care about, Emma. You know that." She nodded, though the knot in her stomach refused to loosen. "Okay," she said, forcing a smile. "I believe you." But as they left the canteen together, Daniel's arm slung casually over her shoulders, Emma couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. The canteen, once a place of comfort, now felt like the setting of a betrayal she wasn't ready to face. And as she glanced back at the table where Daniel and Sophia had been sitting, She couldn't help but wonder if the life she'd built with him was already crumbling beneath her feet. The canteen was alive with a hum of midday activity, a symphony of clattering trays, murmured conversations, and the occasional burst of laughter. Emma stood just inside the entrance, her fingers tightening around the strap of her bag as she scanned the room. She hadn't planned to come here today, but the gnawing suspicion in her chest had grown too loud to ignore. Daniel had been distant again this morning. His responses clipped, his attention elsewhere. He'd left for work without his usual goodbye kiss, muttering something about an early meeting. Emma had tried to shake off the unease, telling herself she was overthinking things. But as the hours ticked by, the memory of Sophia's smirk in the canteen the other day kept resurfacing, taunting her. She spotted them almost immediately. Daniel was seated at the same corner table, his posture relaxed, his tie loosened as though he'd been there for a while. Across from him sat Sophia, her auburn hair cascading over her shoulders as she leaned forward. Her lips curved into a smile that seemed too intimate for a casual work conversation. Emma's stomach churned as she watched them, her heart pounding in her ears. She hesitated, torn between confronting them and turning away. But then Daniel laughed, a deep, genuine laugh that Emma hadn't heard in weeks, and something inside her snapped. She strode toward the table, her heels clicking against the tiled floor with a rhythm that matched the furious beat of her heart. Daniel looked up as she approached, his smile fading into an expression of surprise. "Emma," he said, his voice tinged with unease. "What are you doing here?" "I could ask you the same thing," she replied, her tone sharper than she'd intended. Her gaze flicked to Sophia, who was now sitting back in her chair, her expression unreadable. "We were just going over some case files," Daniel said quickly, his words tumbling out in a rush. "Sophia's been helping me with research for the Johnson trial." Emma raised an eyebrow, her arms crossing over her chest. "In the canteen. During lunch." Daniel opened his mouth to respond, but Sophia cut him off. "It's not a big deal, Emma," she said, her voice smooth and condescending. "Daniel and I have been working closely on this case. Sometimes it's easier to discuss things over a meal." Emma's jaw tightened at the way Sophia said Daniel's name, as though it belonged to her. She turned to Daniel, her eyes searching his face for the truth. "Is that all this is? Work?" Daniel hesitated, his gaze flicking to Sophia before returning to Emma. "Of course," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. "You know how busy things have been lately." Emma wanted to believe him, to let herself be reassured by his words. But the way he avoided her gaze, the way Sophia's smirk lingered in the corner of her vision, it all felt like a betrayal she wasn't ready to face. "Then why does it feel like there's something you're not telling me?" she asked, her voice trembling with the weight of her emotions. Daniel's expression softened, and he reached for her hand. "Emma, you're imagining things," he said gently. "There's nothing going on. You're the only one I care about." She wanted to pull away to demand the truth, but the warmth of his touch was a reminder of the love they'd shared, the life they'd built together. For a moment, she allowed herself to believe him, to push aside the doubts that had been gnawing at her. But then Sophia stood, gathering her things with a deliberate slowness. "I should get back to work," she said, her tone light but her eyes sharp as they met Emma's. "It was nice seeing you again, Emma." Emma watched as Sophia walked away, her hips swaying with a confidence that felt like a challenge. She turned back to Daniel, her heart heavy with the weight of everything left unsaid. "I need you to be honest with me," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "If there's something going on between you and Sophia, I need to know." Daniel's grip on her hand tightened, his expression earnest. "There's nothing going on," he said firmly. "I promise." Emma searched his eyes, looking for the truth behind his words. She wanted to believe him, to let herself be comforted by his touch. But the image of him laughing with Sophia, the way their heads had been so close together, lingered in her mind like a shadow. "Okay," she said finally, forcing a smile. "I believe you." But as they left the canteen together, Daniel's arm slung casually over her shoulders, Emma couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. The canteen, once a place of comfort, now felt like the setting of a betrayal she wasn't ready to face. And as she glanced back at the table where Daniel and Sophia had been sitting, she couldn't help but wonder if the life she'd built with him was already crumbling beneath her feet. The days that followed the canteen encounter were a blur of sleepless nights and hollow conversations. Emma moved through her routine like a ghost, her mind replaying the scene on an endless loop. Daniel's uneasy smile, Sophia's smug smirk, the way their laughter had echoed in the crowded room. She tried to push the thoughts aside, to focus on work and the life she and Daniel had built together. But the cracks in their relationship were growing harder to ignore. Daniel had been unusually attentive since that day, bringing her coffee in the mornings, surprising her with takeout from her favorite restaurant, and filling their evenings with small talk that felt forced and hollow. It was as though he was trying to compensate for something, though he never addressed the tension that hung between them like a storm cloud. Emma wanted to believe his efforts were genuine, to let herself be comforted by his gestures. But every time she looked at him, she saw the shadow of Sophia's smile, the way her hand had lingered on his arm as she'd left the canteen. The doubts gnawed at her, eroding the foundation of trust she'd once taken for granted. One evening, as they sat on the couch watching a movie neither of them was paying attention to, Emma finally broke the silence. "Daniel," she said, her voice trembling with the weight of everything she'd been holding back. "We need to talk." Daniel paused the movie, his expression wary. "About what?" Emma took a deep breath, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "About Sophia," she said, her voice steady despite the storm raging inside her. "I need to know the truth. Is there something going on between you two?" Daniel's face fell, and for a moment, he looked as though he might deny it. But then he sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Emma, it's not what you think," he said, his voice heavy with regret. Her heart sank at his words, the confirmation of her worst fears. "Then what is it?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Daniel hesitated, his gaze dropping to the floor. "Sophia and we've been spending a lot of time together," he admitted. "But it's not serious. It was just a mistake." Emma felt as though the ground had been ripped out from under her. "A mistake," she repeated, her voice rising with anger and disbelief. "How long has this been going on?" Daniel winced at her tone, his guilt written plainly on his face. "A few weeks," he said quietly. "I never meant for it to happen. It just did." Emma stood, her hands trembling as she wrapped her arms around herself. "How could you do this to me?" she asked, her voice breaking. "After everything we've been through, how could you throw it all away for her?" Daniel stood too, reaching for her hand, but she pulled away. "Emma, I'm sorry," he said, his voice desperate. "I never wanted to hurt you. Love you. You have to believe me." "Do I?" she shot back, her eyes blazing with anger and pain. "Because right now, it feels like everything you've ever said to me was a lie." Daniel's shoulders slumped, his expression one of defeat. "I know I messed up," he said. "But I want to fix this. I want to make things right." Emma shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "I don't know if you can," she said, her voice barely audible. "I don't know if I can ever trust you again." The room fell silent, the weight of her words hanging heavily in the air. Daniel looked as though he wanted to say more, to argue his case, but he seemed to realize that there were no words that could undo the damage he'd caused. "I'll give you some space," he said finally, his voice heavy with regret. "If that's what you need." Emma nodded, her arms still wrapped tightly around herself. "I think that's for the best," she said, her voice hollow. Daniel hesitated for a moment, as though hoping she might change her mind. But when she didn't, he turned and walked out of the room, leaving Emma alone with her thoughts. As the door clicked shut behind him, Emma sank onto the couch, her body trembling with the weight of everything she'd been holding back. The life she'd built with Daniel, the future she'd envisioned for them, it all felt like a distant memory, shattered by his betrayal. But amidst the pain and anger, a small spark of determination flickered to life. She wouldn't let this define her. She wouldn't let Daniel's mistakes dictate her future.